King Charles had weathered family scandal, public disgrace, and years of quiet tension, but nothing could have readied him for the folder laid before Parliament that morning. Music. The papers did not simply challenge Queen Camilla's conduct. They appeared to reveal fraudulent estate transfer documents, music, bearing royal authorization that Charles maintained he had never granted. When the king finally examined the contested signature, music those present expected outrage. Instead, he fell completely still. Before we go any further into what this truly means for the royal family, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a single update. Charles examined the same signature 3 separate times before setting the pages down on the table. Music Parliament had uncovered concealed estate transfer records connected to Camilla's household, and the charge was catastrophic. Music, valuable royal-linked property holdings had been reassigned through paperwork bearing the monarch's supposed authorization. An estate transfer instrument is a legal document used to shift ownership or control of property between parties. But here the implications were explosive because the king maintained he had never authorized it. Music. The records indicated that his authority had been duplicated and applied. Camilla learned that her office had been referenced in the parliamentary file. She did not ask what the press would report. She asked whether Charles had reviewed the documents. That revealed where her fear truly resided. The queen consort understood that public criticism was manageable, but a falsified signature threatened the trust within the marriage and the stability of the crown itself. Charles continued reading. The longer he studied the approval notation, the more the atmosphere in the room seemed to close in. The first inconsistency surfaced in the date. A parliamentary clerk flagged one approval entry connected to an estate holding that under its trust arrangement was never permitted to transfer without direct royal sign-off. A trust arrangement is a legal framework governing how property is held and administered for designated beneficiaries or purposes. Music. The notation claimed Charles had authorized the transfer on a day when his confirmed schedule placed him in an entirely different location. That was not a clerical error. It was the first definitive break between the official record and the king's actual whereabouts. Music. William was then informed of something still more disturbing. His name appeared in an internal objection attached to the original transfer file, yet that objection had disappeared before the final documents were completed. The prince had not simply been left out. His opposition may have been deliberately wiped from the record. Charles set down the folder, removed his glasses, and finally asked the question no one in the room wanted to address. Who signed this using my name? But before the palace could determine who had replicated the king's authority, one question became unavoidable. How much had Camilla known before Parliament unsealed the file? The scandal was serious because it involved property, music, signatures, and parliamentary scrutiny. But for Charles, those specifics were almost beside the point. At the heart of the crisis stood the woman by his side, and a question no monarch wishes to confront within his own marriage. Had his trust been weaponized to protect something he would never have sanctioned? As Camilla waited for him to speak, silence grew more menacing than any accusation. Charles refused to meet with her immediately. That choice cut more deeply than any public statement could have. The king depended on loyalty within a monarchy, where private bonds and constitutional obligation could never remain separate for long. Constitutional duty simply means the monarch must preserve the integrity of the crown, even when family relationships make that agonizing. Camilla understood that reality because the disputed estate documents had passed through administrative channels directly connected to her household. Her name was now tied not only to a contentious transfer, but to the possibility that royal authority had been exploited. Camilla listened as a member of staff quietly informed her that Charles required time alone. She cleared the room, reached for the telephone, then drew her hand back before picking it up. The queen consort wanted to call him, but she recognized that forcing the conversation could deepen the harm. She remained alone instead, aware that the man who had defended her through years of condemnation was now questioning whether she had hidden something from him. William faced an entirely different dilemma. Music. He wanted to shield his father from yet another personal blow. Yet the prince also recognized that protecting Charles from the evidence would only erode his position further. He demanded that every document be reviewed, including an internal memorandum containing his own earlier objection to changes in estate oversight. A memorandum is simply a formal written record used to document advice, objections, or instructions. When investigators compared the files, they confirmed that his objection had been stripped out before the new approval packet was forwarded to the palace. Camilla eventually provided her own account in a documented private statement to the internal review. She acknowledged that she had approved discussions about restructuring the estate arrangement, but insisted she had never directed anyone to reproduce Charles's signature or fabricate his consent. Music. That distinction was significant. It separated awareness of the transfer proposal from knowledge of the apparent forgery, but it still did not account for why the process had continued after the king had expressed resistance. Charles absorbed that statement without offering any comfort. Then investigators uncovered something neither of them could dismiss. An old calendar entry from months earlier, marking the precise evening when William challenged the transfer. Camilla pushed for it to continue, and the monarch instructed that nothing proceed without his written authorization. To understand why that overlooked meeting now unsettled everyone involved, the story had to go back to the night when a contentious estate dispute crossed into something far more serious. Months before Parliament encountered a single suspicious signature, the warning had already been delivered. It arrived during a private estate meeting that nearly everyone would later wish had never occurred. What started as a disagreement over management rights concluded with William refusing to sanction a proposed transfer, Camilla pressing for reconsideration, and Charles assuming the matter had been deferred. Yet someone departed that room resolved to push the transfer through regardless. William had contested the proposal because the property was not a conventional private holding. It sat within a royal-linked estate structure, with rules limiting how control could be reassigned without formal authorization. In straightforward terms, the ownership framework meant no one could quietly shift key interests without producing a clear legal trail. Camilla believed those restrictions had grown obsolete. She argued that restructuring would streamline management and improve efficiency. Music. But the prince identified something more troubling, a change that could later appear to be private influence reshaping royal assets. Camilla interpreted his resistance as a pointed accusation. She told William that persistent suspicion made routine estate decisions nearly impossible, and he replied that royal stewardship demanded greater care, not less. Charles observed the exchange grow more entrenched. The king recognized that the dispute was no longer about documents. Music. It had become a test of loyalty between his wife and his son. With both sides convinced they were defending something vital, Charles brought the meeting to a close before hostilities became visible. He slid the unsigned transfer sheet back across the table and made his instruction unambiguous. Nothing was to move forward without his written authorization. That Windsor meeting, held 3 months before Parliament opened the records, became the decisive turning point. His directive should have ended it. William understood it as a definitive refusal. Camilla collected her papers in silence, said nothing, and departed with the matter apparently resolved. Days later, the unthinkable occurred. Music. A revised transfer packet resurfaced within the administrative chain, bearing what appeared to be the very authorization Charles had declined to give. Music. The alteration was not minor. The rejected draft had been replaced, music, and William's formal objection had been removed from the file entirely. A documented internal record later revealed that someone had eliminated his memorandum before the new packet advanced. William would eventually understand that his warning had not been overlooked by accident. Someone had deliberately removed the obstacle he represented. Camilla would later maintain, through her private documented statement, that she never authorized the alteration, while Charles was left grappling with a far grimmer possibility. Someone within the system had concluded that his refusal was simply a problem requiring a solution. Months later, when that rejected document resurfaced bearing the king's signature, Charles no longer needed another briefing. Music. He needed Camilla in the room with him. Charles did not call for advisors, solicitors, or senior courtiers. He asked for Camilla alone. Between them lay the parliamentary file, open to the signature neither could dismiss. For several seconds the king said nothing. Then he pushed the falsified authorization across the table and posed the question that had consumed him since that morning. Not who had created it, not who had filed it, but whether his wife had known. Camilla understood immediately why the question stung more than the document itself. Parliamentary investigators had already confirmed that the transfer packet had moved through administrative channels linked to her household. Those channels are simply the network of staff, approvals, and internal offices through which state paperwork passes before reaching final authorization. Charles knew that awareness of a transfer was not equivalent to directing a forgery, but emotionally that distinction brought him little relief. Music. He needed to know whether she had watched the process advance after his refusal and chosen to say nothing. Charles asked her plainly whether she had known his approval was manufactured. Camilla denied it. She insisted she had never witnessed a false signature being produced, never instructed anyone to replicate his name, and never been informed that the authorization was invented. Then came the admission that shifted the atmosphere of the room. The Queen Consort acknowledged that she had anticipated the transfer proceeding after the Windsor disagreement, because she assumed officials were still working through the objections. Camilla hesitated when he asked why she had never raised that expectation with him. She said she had believed the matter was being resolved through proper channels, and that William's concerns were being addressed through standard internal review. Charles did not respond immediately. Instead, the king retrieved another page and placed it before her. It was the prince's missing memorandum, the objection that should have remained within the approval file. Music. Camilla read the opening paragraph and stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table and said quietly that she had never seen it before. That single statement redirected the crisis. William's objection had not dissolved through routine administrative handling. Someone had deliberately removed it. Then she noticed a routing notation bearing the initials of a senior household official she recognized well. Her defense halted mid-sentence. Charles saw the shift in her expression at once. Camilla now grasped that someone close to her may have manipulated the process, deceived her, and exploited the king's authority as cover. He ordered the official removed from estate responsibilities without delay. But William, having reviewed the documented chain, cautioned his father that one individual could not have altered every stage independently. Camilla's denial redirected the crisis, but it did not diminish it, because the central question was no longer whether a document had been falsified, but who possessed sufficient access to make the forgery function. A forged signature is merely ink until someone accepts it as real. That recognition transformed the palace scandal overnight. The further investigators examined the records, the less the case resembled the conduct of one reckless official. Files had been rerouted. Objections had disappeared. Internal safeguards had been circumvented. Music. And somewhere between Camilla's household, the estate administration, and the final approval process, someone had understood precisely which doors needed to open and which individuals needed to remain quiet. William sat with Charles and measured each word with care. The prince knew his father was already carrying the burden of a fractured marriage, a public scandal, and the knowledge that his authority had been used without consent. But he also recognized that hesitation could compound the damage. The crown's estate system required multiple layers of documented authorization, meaning a successful forgery demanded more than a false signature. It required access, precise timing, and people willing to allow the paperwork to advance. Charles admitted the truth quietly. Examining Camilla's household felt like examining part of his own home. The king understood that any scrutiny could surface private conversations, trusted staff, and decisions never intended to leave palace walls. Yet, shielding those individuals would risk something far graver: the impression that royal standing could place someone beyond consequences. William set the investigative authorization beside him. His father studied the signature line, signed it, and returned the pen without a word. Investigators moved swiftly once that authority was granted. A documented review of the administrative pathway revealed that the falsified approval had been accompanied by a backdated routing note. A routing note is simply an internal record showing where a document traveled, who handled it, and at what point. By altering that date, someone had made the transfer appear as though every required stage had occurred in proper sequence. The following discovery raised the stakes considerably. A second estate record indicated that long-term control of the property would ultimately have passed to a structure benefiting individuals selected through Camilla's administrative circle. The Queen Consort had not yet been proven to have directed anything unlawful, but the optics were ruinous. Her office was now connected to both the pathway and the probable beneficiaries. Then the paper trail turned directly back toward her. Music. An internal log revealed that Camilla herself had requested a status update on the transfer, after Charles had already instructed that nothing proceed without his written authorization. William read the entry twice. The king did the same. Music. That authorization granted investigators permission to examine everything. But the first finding they returned with threatened to collapse Camilla's defense entirely. By the following morning, Camilla was no longer contending with a single suspicious document. She was confronting a timeline. Her calls, administrative requests, meeting notes, and estate updates were being placed alongside the forged transfer records one by one. The picture was distressing music and increasingly difficult to account for. She continued to deny directing any false signature, but one newly recovered message confirmed she had continued inquiring about the transfer after Charles had considered the matter closed. Camilla received the suspension order privately and grasped immediately who had authorized it. Music. Charles had instructed the disputed estate transfer to be frozen. Music and had removed her estate-related. Staff of independent authority while investigators separated legitimate decisions from manipulated records. Music. A suspension order is a formal directive that temporarily halts an action or authority while a matter is under review. She read his authorization slowly, folded the page once, then asked everyone present to leave the room. Music Charles faced mounting pressure to speak in her defense publicly, but the king declined. He told advisors that safeguarding the crown no longer meant protecting individuals from uncomfortable truths. It meant allowing the record to stand before loyalty shaped the conclusion. That decision cost him because Camilla was not simply another figure under scrutiny. She was his wife. Yet he also understood that a single premature defense could make every subsequent finding appear tainted. Camilla's position deteriorated further when investigators recovered her own request for a progress update on the transfer following the Windsor meeting. The Queen Consort had stated that she believed the proposal was being handled through normal channels. But this message appeared to indicate that she was still actively monitoring its progression. She reread the date and felt the significance at once. If she had known the transfer was still advancing, Charles would inevitably ask why she had never informed him. Then the next message altered everything once again. A documented reply to Camilla's inquiry, Music, stated that royal authorization had been secured. She stopped when she reached those words. The message had been sent after Charles had instructed that nothing move forward without his written consent. Someone had explicitly told her that the king had reversed his position. Camilla pressed her fingers against her forehead. As the sequence finally became clear, her request no longer automatically implicated her. It introduced a different possibility. She may have continued because someone within the administrative chain had falsely assured her that his approval was genuine. Music. The same person who had manipulated the paperwork may also have manipulated her understanding of what the monarch had decided. Charles read through the recovered exchange and said nothing for an extended moment. For the first time, the evidence did not point solely at Camilla. It also lent credibility to part of her account. For the first time, the evidence could support Camilla's version of events, but only one conversation could determine whether Charles was prepared to believe her again. There were no secretaries at the table, no parliamentary documents being exchanged between officials, and no legal advisors translating every phrase. Music Charles and Camilla finally faced one another without the weight of the institution between them. The king had spent days asking whether his authority had been stolen. Camilla had spent those same days wondering whether her husband believed she had taken it. What followed did not erase the scandal, but it reshaped where responsibility would ultimately rest. Camilla spoke first because the recovered correspondence had already altered the contours of the case. It demonstrated that she had been informed Charles had reversed his refusal and formally sanctioned the estate transfer. Investigators had traced that message to a senior official with access to both her estate communications and the approval routing process. That process is simply the internal chain used to move documents from one decision point to the next. The same individual had been positioned closely enough to shape what she saw and what the king was told. Camilla did not shelter behind procedure. She acknowledged privately that she should have questioned the sudden reversal, rather than accepting it because it produced the result she had sought. "I should have come to you directly," she said. Charles considered her for a long moment before responding. "Yes, you should have." The words were restrained, but they carried more weight than raised voices. The king believed she had not ordered the false signature, yet her failure to speak to him directly had damaged something far more difficult to rebuild. Camilla then produced a handwritten personal note she had composed when she first learned that Charles had supposedly reversed his decision. The documented note recorded her surprise at the reversal and her relief that the transfer could proceed. It corroborated her claim that she had believed the authorization was legitimate. The Queen Consort had made a serious error. But the evidence was beginning to draw a distinction between that error and the act of forgery itself. Charles received the definitive conclusion shortly after. Access records placed the senior official at the center of all three critical moments: the falsified authorization, William's suppressed memorandum, and the misleading message sent to Camilla. The pattern was no longer coincidental. Someone had orchestrated the process from within. Charles reached his decision without ceremony. Camilla would be cleared of personally falsifying his approval, but she would permanently surrender control over the estate management channel through which the deception had been sustained. She accepted the consequence because both understood the same painful truth. Innocence of forgery did not negate a failure of judgment. Music. Their marriage had endured the private reckoning, but the monarchy still had to endure the public one, and by morning, Britain had already settled on the image that would define the scandal. The scandal cleared palace walls before dawn. Across Britain, the debate was no longer confined to property law or internal royal procedure. It had become a question of trust, whose signature could be relied upon, whether private influence had crossed a constitutional boundary, and whether Charles could hold members of his own household to account. Then, one newspaper front page distilled Music Days of evidence into a single unsparing image: the king's disputed signature, enlarged to fill the entire page. Charles observed the coverage alongside William and said almost nothing. Parliament had released a condensed chronology, confirming that his authorization had been falsified and that the estate transfer had been halted before final implementation. A condensed chronology is simply an official timeline recording what took place, in what sequence, and who was responsible at each stage. That mattered because the public could now trace the deception as a connected series of events. Music, rather than an unsubstantiated claim. The palace also announced a restructuring of estate authorization procedures, signaling clearly that the existing system had broken down severely enough to demand immediate reform. William listened as broadcasters characterized the scandal as a betrayal originating from within the royal household. The prince watched the words reach his father, one after another. Charles had already come to terms with the fact that his authority had been duplicated. Hearing the nation describe that act as betrayal made the wound feel personal all over again. Music. When one presenter asked whether the king had been safeguarded by his own staff or exploited by them, William reached for the remote and switched off the television. His father did not ask for it to be turned back on. Camilla faced a separate humiliation: music. She had escaped the gravest charge because the evidence supported her claim that she had not directed the forged signature. But the queen consort understood that the public's confidence in her judgment had still been shaken. She had accepted an approval she desired without verifying it with Charles. That lapse now appeared alongside every headline, even if it fell short of forgery itself. Then one image captured the entirety of the scandal. The Daily Chronicle published an enlarged reproduction of the disputed signature under the headline, "Signed by whom?" Television broadcasters repeatedly placed it beside an authenticated example of Charles's handwriting, reducing a complicated estate inquiry to something millions could comprehend at a glance. Crowds gathered outside. Buckingham Palace as broadcasters announced that the senior estate official responsible for routing the falsified records music had been dismissed and referred for further investigation. The atmosphere was no longer one of curiosity. It was one of reckoning. By evening, Charles understood what remained. He could return to the palace's long-standing instinct for quiet containment, or he could make every consequence a matter of public record. Music. By evening, the deception had been laid bare. The public had rendered its judgment. Only the king's final verdict remained. Charles could not undo the forged signature. He could not reclaim the moment when he sat across a table questioning whether his own wife had helped misuse his authority. And he could not restore the trust that had vanished the moment Parliament unsealed those records. But he could determine what came next. In the end, the king's response grew larger than the transfer itself, because Charles chose accountability even when accountability reached directly into his marriage. Charles received the final investigative conclusion without ceremony. Music. The review confirmed that he had never authorized the estate transfer, and that his approval had been deliberately fabricated by a senior official who manipulated the internal authorization chain. That chain is simply the sequence of individuals and verification steps required before a major estate decision becomes binding. The finding mattered because it exonerated the monarch while establishing that someone embedded in the royal system had exploited his authority as a tool. Camilla received a different conclusion. She was cleared of personally producing or directing the forged signature, but she was formally removed from independent involvement in the affected estate management structure because she had failed to confirm the supposed reversal of Charles's decision directly with him. The Queen Consort accepted the consequence without public objection. He told her privately that he believed she had not falsified his name, but the king made equally clear that trust could not simply be restored because the most serious accusation had been withdrawn. William watched his father reach the final decision and understood its cost immediately. The prince had witnessed Charles defend family members through difficult moments before, but on this occasion, the monarch chose institutional integrity over personal loyalty. The suppressed memorandum carrying William's warning was reinstated in the official record, and the manipulated transfer was permanently invalidated. New procedures were established requiring direct authentication for future high-level estate transfers, ensuring that no significant approval could advance without confirmation from the individual whose authority was being invoked. Charles then signed the final cancellation order and set down the pen. He told William that no royal household could ask for public trust while refusing to apply accountability to itself. The senior official at the heart of the falsified approval chain was permanently removed from royal estate responsibilities, sealing the pathway through which the deception had functioned. Camilla remained beside Charles, but something between them had shifted. She retained her place, yet her authority was diminished, and their bond carried a permanent mark. William departed with renewed assurance that the monarchy could hold itself accountable, even when loyalty became a liability. The forged estate transfer devastated Charles because it turned private trust into public evidence. Yet his final decision gave the scandal its defining meaning. The monarchy could survive embarrassment, betrayal, and even deliberate deception, but only when the crown demonstrated that no relationship, not even the king's own marriage, stood above the demand for accountability. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.